Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Ana Campos, and I'm the Assistant Director here at Central Library. John Sabo is our city librarian, and I'm here on behalf of John Sabo. He was unable to attend today's event. As you know, Central Library, it's one of the 73 branches that we have throughout the city of Los Angeles. We offer many programs for the public, including immigration services, online high school programs, homeless resources, job searching, literacy programs, homework help, among many other things. And if I talk about the library, I'll be talking here all day, and I know we're ready for the event. So again, welcome to Central Library, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much for being here for this presidential plenary. Thanks for your patience. We waited on a couple of events that were moving a little bit slower than expected, and we'll probably be joined by others as the evening moves on. I'm Bill Deverell, and it's just a real pleasure to have these guests from Northern California and one from Southern California with us today. I want to start with thanks to the Los Angeles Public Library. When the meeting started to coalesce around the Bonaventure, I knew I wanted to try to have events or an event over here. We do a fair number of things in this Mark Taper Auditorium. As you can see, it's beautiful, and it's a real important civic space for us here in LA, so it's wonderful to bring you all here, and for many of you, to have you here for the first time. Before I introduce our seated guests on the stage, I want to welcome my friend and colleague Cindy Alvitre to welcome you. Cindy is an educator, an activist, an artist, and is a descendant of the Tongva Gabrielino peoples of the Los Angeles Basin. She teaches American Indian Studies at California State University, Long Beach, and I'm thrilled and grateful to have Cindy join you right now for a few words of welcome. Cindy.
Where we stand, Meha, Meahwen, and good afternoon. Netwanan Cindy Alvitre. I'm affiliated with Tiat Society and the Traditional Council of Pimu, the maritime community of Gabrielino Tongva coastal people. It's really beautiful to see all you human beings here at this very important time on our collective Mother Earth and the nature. Firstly, I want to acknowledge our ancestors of this land and their descendants, the Amupavitam, the ancestors, and the Hunukvitam, the pre-contact human beings that occupied this land, because we are all their descendants. When it comes down to it, we are all ancestors and descendants of earth-based tribes at the very beginning of all of our ancestry. I like to acknowledge that. It's important. So as I stand here at this podium, I'm reminded of where we are located at this very moment, where we stand. We are at the intersection of earliest Los Angeles history where the pre- and post-contact villages of Yangna and others once stood. This is when the people were removed from the islands, the 4 Southern Channel Islands, and were brought in the early 19th century to Los Angeles, and they established refugee villages such as Yangna. As first contact tribes, the Tongva and other coastal tribes became a buffer that delayed the colonial impacts to inland tribes. The impacts were severe and permanent. As children, we read in the history books that the Gabrielino were extinct. Wow, that's pretty heavy. The irony of this moment is yesterday marked 238 years since Toipurina, her disruption of the ongoing Spanish colonial intrusion at San Gabriel Mission. On October 25th, 1785, a young Hujubit woman, only 23 years old and carrying her first child, took a stand as a sabia, someone who knows, and led others, mostly men, in a courageous attempt to end the tyranny of the mission system that had severely impacted her family and her communities and their traditional homeland. Her narrative is embraced by communities, and so many throughout this city who recognize, respect, and include the earliest history of this incredible space that has lured almost 4 million people to call this home. Oh, quick note too, Los Angeles is also has the highest population Native Americans in the United States, in a close competition consistently with New York. And as history would have it, it's also a very personal moment for me and my family. And as history will reveal, it's very complex and ultimately can be the release of silence knowings, those things that we keep within us, because to release them, those secrets, has serious consequences, whether those are personal, familial, or communal. My great-grandfather, Sebastiano Alvitre, multiple grandfathers, generations back, was a soldier that came with Portola in that first expedition, the first wave of destruction to the people. At the same time that Toipurina was being held in custody after she was arrested, my grandfather was also held in custody for a very serious crime. He was charged with the abuse of an Indian woman. The stigma of this crime remained within our family until recently, when historic research revealed another side of the story. Perhaps a story more common than we know. The story of a soldier and a neophyte, an Indian woman who had forcibly been converted, who fell in love but were denied the relationship as she had an arranged marriage with another neophyte at her respective mission. They ran away to San Gabriel, and upon arrival, both were taken into custody. She was with child, and he was taken into custody. Two narratives. This is so common in history as we continue on. Two narratives, parallel experiences in the same locations. History can be haunting, but it can also be healing. What we can attest to is the fact that history no longer serves as a master narrative for one population. Our lives are filled with immense diversity, especially in the city of Yangna, in the City of Angels. The silence knowings have been released. And as we all know in this room, the story, his story, and her story never ends. I want to end this by sharing with you some Tongva core values that are relevant to all humans on this planet at this very time. I like to refer to these as the responsibility of future responsibilities. Our 3 R's, not reading, writing, arithmetic, but I think young people, what is it, recycle, reuse, and anyway, I'm not going to confuse myself. Recognition, respect, and responsibility. And this is an old Indian formula, so use it. Recognition. When we acknowledge all life around us and all humans that we have contact with every day, then perhaps we can garner that next step in having mutual respect for each other. When we have both of those, acknowledgement, recognition, and respect together, then perhaps we can move forward as human beings into a sustainable, healthy, beautiful future with taking the responsibility for what we need to do. And that's as historians, that's as artists, that's as human beings, that's as people who are all connected. May we embrace the diversity of histories and each other as we all work together to contribute to the future of all humans and all life. We honor the sacrifices of all ancestors, including all of your ancestors, so that we can be here today. Awesh Konaha, thank you for being well.
Thank you, Cindy. Very grateful you could be with us. Welcome to those of you that just joined us. We're going to have a discussion up here between myself and our guests, and then at some appropriate interval, we'd love to turn to your questions and comments. There's that standing microphone at the halfway point here in the auditorium. We'd like you to use that if you could when we break for questions. I had not met in person until this evening Professor William B. Gould IV, the Charles A. Beardsley Professor of Law, Emeritus at Stanford Law School, where he was the first African-American professor of law. Professor Gould has had an extraordinary career, writing widely across labor and discrimination law. Among his distinctions, he chaired the National Labor Relations Board. The first William Benjamin Gould, Professor Gould's great-grandfather, escaped from enslavement, joined the Union Navy, and kept a diary, which Professor Gould edited and brought out as the book Diary of a Contraband in 2002. He has a new book coming out, his 12th, his memoirs, entitled Those Who Travel and Are Heavy Laden, Memoirs of a Labor Lawyer, which will soon be published by Georgetown Press. Professor Beth Piatote is an associate professor in the English and Comp Lit departments at UC Berkeley. She's wide-ranging interests and expertise, including Native American literature, arts and creative expression, history, law, and language revitalization. She co-created and is now the chair of the designated emphasis in Indigenous languages revitalization on her campus. Probably best known to our Western history community for her book, Domestic Subjects, Gender, Citizenship, and the Law in Native American Literature, Beth is also an accomplished playwright and creative writer. Beth is Nez Perce, an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. She has 2 forthcoming books. The Nez Perce word, or just Nez Perce? Nez Perce Word for Shark, which is a collection of her poetry, soon to be published with Milkweed. And out of the new series coming out of Norton called Norton Shorts, Living with History, Notes on the Indigenous Everyday. Please join me in welcoming our 2 guests as we engage in a discussion about language, law, and restorative justice. So we heard from Cindy, as well as a little bit in the introduction to the 2 of you, about lineage, about family, about grandfathers, great and great-great. Can we start there? Bill, do you mind telling us a bit about William Gould, or the first William Gould?
Thanks. Oh, thanks very much, Bill. The first William B. Gould was born as a slave in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1837. And during the war, escaped slavery. He joined the United States Navy and fought for what he always characterized as Uncle Samuel, rather than Uncle Sam, for between 1862 and 1865, and kept a diary throughout that period. He also, as it turns out, wrote essays for a magazine that was published in New York City called The Anglo-African, and talking about his experiences during the war. He was an unusual person because, as many may know, all of the states that were in rebellion against the United States of America, the Confederate States, prohibited Black Americans from being taught to read and write. And he not only was able to read and write, and many of his comrades, many Black comrades, were able to read and write, and he did so quite eloquently. He escaped the very night that the night before President Lincoln was convening his cabinet to consider a so-called preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And when he arrived on the ship, he was characterized as a contraband, which of course we think of today as seized property. And that is the idea that the North established for Blacks coming to fight for the United States. There were approximately 18,000 who fought in the United States Navy, and 7,000 of them left the Confederate States, as did William B. Gould. And he came on board, and the log of the ship says 8 contraband came on board today that lists their names and their masters. And of course, this was a great discovery for me. John Hope Franklin, the great John Hope Franklin, had written a memorandum for me on the diary, and he was worried. He didn't know, we didn't know whether William B. Gould, for a long time, whether he was free or slave. And John Hope Franklin was of the view that his literacy was such that it seemed unusual to him at that time that he would be someone who had escaped slavery. He had, and he fought part of the North Atlantic blockading squadron that was trying to shut down Confederate supplies coming to aid Lee in Virginia, and then the last part of the war, 1864, 1865, chasing Confederate ships that were being built in Europe for the Confederates.
Thank you, Bill. Beth, can you take up that same question and the ways in which family memory and history inform your work?
Tatskalawat. Inwas Beth Piatote, Inwas Waluopu, Colville Katsiyaoville, Nunusi Glautiwama. Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. My name is Beth Piatote. I am a Walawa band, Nez Perce, enrolled at Colville. And thank you for this question. After we were invited and had our first conversation, I realized that Bill's grandfather's grandfather had experienced slavery and escaped slavery, and my grandfather's grandfather was the sole member of my family who survived the Nez Perce War of 1877. And so thinking of just that close are these, of course we're in the group of historians, of course you're always thinking about how close the 19th century is or the 17th century or whatever it is. But I did think it was such an interesting moment to get to share a stage and think about how close we are to those generations. Just, you know, I knew my grandfather, I was held by him, he was held by his grandfather, and that was the person who survived this war in 1877. And then I started thinking about some of the Nez Perce, or not Nez Perce, some of the native teachings around the concept of the 7 generations. And there are 2 ways I've heard this teaching, and one is that we should be making decisions based on the 7th generation to follow. That's a common teaching. But there's another teaching that I've heard, which is that you think of yourself as part of 7 generations, and that your generation is always the 4th generation. And so you are just that far removed from the guidance of your elders, but you can also think how close you are to the people coming, and you should make your decisions based on that location as being part of the 4th generation. And I think when we're talking about restoration and social justice, that for me is a scale of time that's easier to understand and act upon. And so I think 4th generation thinking within 7th generation thinking that comes from some native teachings. I heard this from my Lakota friend. I find that very useful for thinking about what kinds of actions we can take today.
Thank you. Bill, you're a lawyer, you're well published in legal history, you're surrounded by concepts of justice. Tell us a little bit about the ways in which your family genealogy guides your hand in research and teaching in the arenas of justice.
Well, I would say that there is a direct connection between the environment that my parents provided and the ideas that they instilled in me and my career in law. My great-grandfather died 13 years before I was born, but when my father lived, there were 3 William B. Goulds until my father was about 21, living side by side with one another in Massachusetts. And my father told me from time to time, this was prior to the time that my father had discovered this diary. We only discovered it in 1958 about some of the things that William B. Gould had done. But I think that what they left with me was a view that was not widely, views that were not widely held. When we went to Washington and looked at the memorial, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, one of the first things that my father said to me was, you're looking at the memorial of a slaveholder. And we looked at Washington, and we talked about the slaves that Washington held, and how, of course, Washington tried to press the British to return his slaves to him at the time of the Revolutionary War. This was their path to escape in New York City. And as a child, my father would say to me, this is, when we would talk about Reconstruction, it was taught in the traditional Claude Bowers tragic era idea. He'd say, this is wrong, what you're getting in these textbooks. And this is because this is the South's first chance at democracy, for a very limited period of time after the war. So I think that getting a sense of history and having a sense of the discrimination that was visited upon him as he attempted to find his way. He never spoke about it in terms of his own personal, anything that happened to him personally, but he bore it with great dignity, and he was an extremely patriotic man, as all of the Goulds were. The great-uncles fought in World War I in France. My grandfather fought in the Spanish-American War. And they had a great sense of patriotism, but a great sense of the basic wrong that had been done to Black Americans and others in this country.
Thanks. I want to note for our audience that Bill informed us tonight there's another William B. Gould, and then another William B. Gould, Bill's son and grandson. And you're in an audience of historians. The entire room wants to know how and where and why that diary was discovered in 1958.
My father was a great favorite of one of my great uncles who fought in World War I, Uncle Lawrence, who was a bachelor who bequeathed all of his property to my father in 1958 when he died. He was one of the last of them to die, and my father drove up. Our home we had moved to New Jersey, and my father drove up to Massachusetts and went up into the attic. And the workmen were already there throwing things out. And, but he found this diary in the attic. And my mother told me that my father had spoken with my great uncle about my great-grandfather and what he had done in the war, but he was not aware of this diary until this time, and brought it home and read it and said to me, this is something you really want to take a very careful look at.
Thank you. Beth, I want to hear you reflect a bit on the ways in which your teaching, your entire career, if you choose to go that deep with it, has been motivated and continues to be motivated by a particular vision of justice and restoration. Or visions.
I just got relaxed here. Like, I was like, oh, this is...
Tell us about another diary.
I do love the crowd reaction, though,
Exactly.
when he's like throwing things out.
Just
Yeah.
the body of your work,
Yeah.
the memories of family and
Yeah.
lineage and oppression and the opposite of justice.
Yeah.
Shape that for us in your career.
Yeah, I think the reason why I was a little stumped by it was because I thought, oh, I don't really remember making that choice. I mean, I think for many of us, we're just born into a set of tasks to do. So, you know, a lot of work I've done at Berkeley has been on repatriation and working with the Hearst and so on, and that I would never choose to do that, but it was never a choice not to. I also think it's funny when I would tell people that my specialization was Native American literature and federal Indian law, and they'd be like, wow, how did you get interested in that? And I'd be like, I was born. I mean, we're just born into some systems that need repair. And so I do think that I've always been trying to do work that moves toward that. And I've been so inspired by other people's work too. But working at the university has given me a chance to support Indigenous language revitalization and to make structural make structural changes that will support other people with their language work, and to reach out and create community collaborations, and to sort of shift some of the capital away from the university back into our communities. And so thank you for recognizing that that is a strong pulse. But it was really the world in which I and many Native people have simply been born into. And I do feel that each person, there's something laid before them that is theirs to do, and that it's our responsibility to open our hearts to what is there for us to pick up and carry.
You're both professionally expert in language and meaning and tone and multiple languages. For you, Beth, and then for you, Bill, does that play into your approach to your own work, the distinction and potential difference between words like repair, restore, reparation, absolution, redemption? Is there a way in which you feel you have to navigate the presumed distinctions between those words?
Yes, I mean, words are so very important, and one of the great joys of studying my own Nez Perce language has been even the smallest differences. So we have two words for and. We have and, that's two things that are separate, and that are two things combined. And really thinking about the use of those two kinds of ands is so illuminating. Yeah, words are important. And I think knowing our Indigenous languages helps us understand not only words, but grammars for operating. When we are operating out of the ways that our languages think, and that the way our languages promote our actions, I think that we open up we open up just worlds that way.
Thank you. Yeah. Bill, how about you?
Well, I became a lawyer. Really, there were no lawyers in my family. I would say my first interest in being a lawyer was sparked by Brown against Board of Education, which declared separate but equal in the schools to be unconstitutional in 1954. That was my senior year in high school, and that and a number of other things caught my attention about the law. And much of my career has been spent on addressing this question of what we do, how we, and we use this word repair, restore, rehabilitate, how we make the law not only compensate and heal, but more prophylactic in terms of influencing the relationship that people are going to be having with one another. I would say that much of my work has been focused upon this problem of remedies, which have been really absent from labor law and employment discrimination law. I became, both prior to the time I went into the academic world and after I did, involved in civil rights class actions. And my father would call me on the phone and say to me, Bill, when are those guys going to get what the law provides for a remedy? When are they going to see compensation? When are they going to see the money that is owed to them in this case? That has been, of course, now we see a renewed attention to this as we see this new discussion, this most recent round of discussions about reparations and the like. And I have had the view that for years that, of course, reparations are appropriate, but the question is, what form do they take, and how can they promote the objectives that we seek and the healing for past conduct that we seek?
And Beth, for you, you've made great strides, as far as I know, in language revitalization and preservation as a reparative act or as a reparative project. Tell us about finding your way there and the restoration impulses. And you can also speak, as we spoke before, about first stop doing harm.
Yeah. Yes, I'm in favor of reparations. I'm in favor of addressing the past. But when it comes into the world of the law, sometimes the only remedy is cash. And from a Native perspective, often that's not what, I mean, money is part of the solution, but it's a long-term set of things. I think Native people have been asking for land and water and language. So cash and payments are kind of quick fixes. And the experience that coming from Native history, if we look at like the Indian Claims Commission or something like that, what we see, I think, historically over time is that when the US government has dealt with Native people, it's been trying to clear the books every time, write a check, make it stop. And there have been, Native people have like stood up and said, no, we want our land back, we want our waters to be cared for. When I talk about language revitalization, sometimes I talk about the restoring sonic ecologies, having the sound of our languages, being born into the sound of your own language. I think that's very important. And also our languages come out of the land. When we're speaking our language, we're also like restoring a whole ecology that is sonic. I want Celilo Falls back. And no check can ever, maybe a check plus dynamite, because one of the things about Celilo Falls, and this is for all the, not just the Nez Perce, but all the Columbia River people, we would go to Celilo Falls every year. And Celilo Falls has, even though it's underwater, a deeper drop than Niagara. And the sound of the falls people talked about how it would fill their bodies. Their bodies would just be reverberating, and how deeply they loved the falls as their relative. And Elizabeth Woody writes about how the silencing of the falls is like growing up hearing people talk about your mother that you never heard her voice. And I think I want that sound back. That's what I want. I want the sound of Celilo Falls going through my body and healing me and connecting me the way my ancestors always felt connected to that place. I don't want the Dalles Dam. There have been successful movements of taking down dams. There have been successful movements of restoration. But, back to your question, I do think, the first step is stop doing harm. So here we are working on repatriation, working on stream restoration, riparian zones, all kinds of things. And another development project is coming in, another pipeline, and everybody's back out protesting and trying to stop the next new thing that's coming out as well. We're also still trying to fix these historic things. So stop doing harm. The second thing that I think is helpful, and I think this is also helpful in thinking about reparations, is thinking about how successful the local is and how successful citizens are for forming coalitions and making change on the ground, and to not, because if you turn to the government, all you're going to get is a check. That's all you'll ever get. I'm saying this as a cynical Native person. And it's going to be way less than you want. And it's not going to give you the thing you really want, which is for every baby to be born hearing their own language. It's not, you're not getting the river back, right? So, but the institution can support, and the government is part of the problem, or part of the solution. Part of the solution. But I've been so inspired by people like Margaret Jacobs and the Reconciliation Rising projects, telling stories of these, people working together. In fact, while we were just waiting to start, you were talking about things you're doing at USC with forest ecology and burn, traditional burnings and things like that. So they're everywhere. We like the Shumash are working on getting like the marine sanctuary, right? So there are so many stories of restoration, but I think those really successful stories are happening through local relationships and through building, these things at a small scale. And so working at multiple scales at the same time. And then the other thing is just have the long view. I am sort of now in the middle of my life thinking, what will I see before I die? Will I see the ancestors go home from Hearst? Maybe that will happen before I die. Will I see Celilo Falls? Probably not. Maybe my grandchildren will, though. So having the long view and never give up. Never give up. That's my advice.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. So, Bill, I'd like you to pick up either or both those threads, if you would. The notion that mere money forecloses deeper needs of healing and convalescence, and or this beautiful distinction Beth made between state-sponsored reparations versus the everyday and the civic.
Well, I think that there are a number of concepts that have emerged about money and about cash compensation. In the employment, I handled a case called Stamps Against Detroit Edison in Detroit, representing 400 black workers who sued to remedy racial discrimination in this utility company. We got, in a period of 2 or 3 years after we had filed the action, change in terms of the way in which jobs were awarded, the ability of blacks to get jobs. The principal plaintiff even had a background in science. He could not be employed in any capacity, and he finally said, "I'll really do anything. I'll sweep the floors," and he was hired on that basis. We broke down the allocation of jobs for blacks who were relegated to so-called low opportunity jobs and pushed them into, got them promoted into high opportunity jobs. But the compensation was important. It took a decade to get it because compensation in the employment relationship gets people's attention, because if it's stiff enough, high enough, it stings. It brings public attention. Sometimes it brings the scorn of many in the public. And so in the Detroit Edison case, we got the first punitive damage award. This was before Congress changed the law to make punitive damages awards explicitly available. The first punitive damage award that had ever been rendered. And we got compensation for the workers while they were waiting to be promoted into the jobs that they should have had in the first instance. So in our view, and I think this is borne out to some extent, this judgment, which is the highest per capita judgment at the time, we're looking at a half a century ago, this judgment affected the relationship. It affected the way in which the company conducted itself and its willingness to treat workers fairly. Now we talk about the state providing reparations for past injuries. And one of the difficulties, and I think that the idea, the concept of some form of reparation is appropriate, but the idea of cash payments is a difficult one, because cash payments to whom and under what circumstances? We've had recently a California commission that was created that decided by a narrow margin to provide cash payments to anyone who could establish a connection with slavery, or whose ancestor was living in the 19th century, was black and living in the 19th century. It's very difficult, I can tell you from personal research, always to connect yourself in this year, 2023, to slavery. I was able to do it because the United States government said in the papers that they recorded when my great-grandfather joined the Navy, he is a contraband. So he couldn't be a contraband without being enslaved. But you're talking about a fairly small, and he wrote a diary, of course, and he, but there are not too many. His is the only diary that I'm aware of that was written by a black sailor, and only one of 3 that were written by the black military during the war. So it's very difficult to establish a connection with slavery. One of the reasons is that although the slave owners were required to record the number of slaves they had for the purpose of the 3/5 rule, you couldn't get 3/5 representation in the Congress if you didn't know how many were enslaved. They didn't record their names, and they only recorded people by gender and age, and sometimes not even that. And my sense is that today we have a real crisis in the United States, a crisis of inequality that affects black Americans and other minorities disproportionately. But the people who are harmed the most today, I would suggest, are the least likely to be able to establish some kind of requisite tie. And there has not been, a satisfactory demarcation line established for eligibility, short of a connection with slavery, which is, I think, a very hard road for most people to travel, given the state of records in the 19th century today.
What's your sense of, other than assiduous work by every historian, what's your sense of how that's solved?
I think, well, solved is a very ambitious
addressed,
word to use.
Addressed, sorry.
But I think that my own sense is this, that, the United States Supreme Court in 1971 handed down a decision called Griggs against Duke Power, arose in the South. And what the court found that this particular company was doing was using standards for employment which were not necessary to perform the work involved. And the use of the standards, and this is where employment discrimination came in, disproportionately excluded blacks. Now, companies didn't have to, the companies had to, they didn't establish two sets of standards. What happened was that they changed the standards for everybody, be they, once they had to really look to see what job relatedness meant, what the test was to be able to perform a particular job accurately. I think reparations can only affect, we have to look at who is it that is being harmed by the health system disproportionately today? Who is it that is at a disadvantage in the educational system today disproportionately? And I think that the remedy, if we may be so bold as to use that word, is in the form of a commitment by this country to use a domestic Marshall Plan, if you will, for our own internal United States of America. Because, and I think, and so many people will object to that. They'll say, well, that's not something aimed at only the people who were harmed by the effects of slavery, because there are other poor people who are being harmed by the system also, and they'll benefit as well. And I think that's true. And I think that just as it was true in the Griggs against Duke Power case, that we began to, for the first time, by virtue of that decision, look at what is fair, what is related, what do you have to do? Don't just establish arbitrary credentials to exclude people. And this made, the effect of Griggs was to make employers look at standards that would apply to the entire workforce. And I think that, as imperfect as it is, we have to have a massive Marshall Plan to address the basic inequities in the country. Now, you may say, well, that's pie in the sky kind of stuff. That's unrealistic. Well, I think it, we're in a very difficult period in our country, but I think that it is more likely to be realized than the idea of cash payments, which inevitably will produce divisiveness and grievances amongst people in our society who say, well, I should have had that. The standards inevitably for cash are arbitrary. Some people talk about, they say, oh, we shouldn't root it in slavery. We should root it in self-identification. Well, who is going to determine that? And under what circumstances will that become the standard if slavery itself is not the standard? So it's not an easy road, but I think the road independent of cash payments as advocated by the California Commission is the better one to travel.
I'm going to ask our guests one or two more questions. If you have questions that you'd like to pose to them, you're welcome in a minute or so to line up behind that microphone, and in a few minutes we'll lift the house lights and take questions and comments from you all. So Beth, you gave a very moving reflection on the power of cultural restoration, landscape restoration, acoustic restoration, really in kind of the everyday and even quotidian walks of life. You're interested in the everyday. It's in your new book. That approach, absolutely. What about this big structural approach that's coming in this world from the federal government and investments in trying to right the ship of inequity? What about that?
Well, I think I was not trying to say that cash is bad.
Right.
It is, it is part of the solution. You know, the material means to change things. But I think that one thing, and I really appreciate what you were saying too at the end, like once we start, you know, talking about cash payments and, you know, it does kind of foreclose a greater imagination about what could happen. When I think about the discourse around reparations, I just have to think about the Indian Claims Commission and this 32-year project in which, you know, there were basically 3 phases. You know, there's, you know, the tribes had to come forward and establish that they are the ones who could make the claim. So exactly the same thing that you're talking about, where someone would have to explain their genealogy or whatever the bar is, they would have to say that they are the ones who have the right. And then they do this assessment phase where they think, well, what would, you know, 90 million acres be worth in 1852? We don't really know. We'll just assign a number, you know? And so there was this kind of randomness that happened. So there are a whole bunch of things went wrong in phase 1. A whole bunch more things went wrong in phase 2. But then the third part is that they would like subtract from that. You know, what they would adjust the numbers after that. I know it's slipping my mind what this piece is called. So I could just, like, this court system is handled to identify damage and judgments and make cash payments. But the court system isn't a larger system of law that is concerned with right relationships or other kinds of non-monetary aspects. But there are other aspects of the government that are. So, you know, the government does have control over our lands, our waters, things like that. We do have to partner and think big picture. Like, what kind of a world do we want? How can we right the world in so many ways? I think that everyone should have clean water. We shouldn't have situations like Flint. You know, we shouldn't be, you know, we shouldn't have individual communities experiencing disproportionate and wrong, deeply, deeply horrifying experiences. Water should be an easy thing that we should all care about and take care of. But it's very hard to even cut through that.
One of the difficulties here, I think, that we have to struggle with is this, that, as I say, the people, and we just can look around us here in Los Angeles today or in any place in the United States and much of the world and say, here are people who need help. But the people who need help, I think, are the last to do well under this kind of system. You know, I've been very lucky in life. I've been very lucky in life because the system of race, which hurt my father, my forebears, so badly, it has stung me, and I'm sure it has hurt me in circumstances, but I'm very lucky. I'm very lucky in life. I don't want a dime from Uncle Samuel. And I think there are others like me, and I could prove that I'm directly related to slavery. That can't be the litmus test. It can't be the basis for fairness when the most impoverished and need of societal assistance are the least likely to be able to establish whatever requisite eligibility is employed.
You mentioned clean water in Flint. Environmental racism is an act in demanding justice and response. from your perspective, how possible or active are the overlaps between African American search for environmental justice through, let's say, clean water, Indigenous groups search for environmental redress, the line drawn between, it seems utterly arbitrary in certain ways, other than the differences of historical trajectory. So what about the real possible for political change through grassroots social and electoral movements that combine these hurts?
Well, I think the hurts are obviously common to both groups. The hurt done to the Native American is the greatest of all, because the hurt done to Native American was genocide, to deprive the people of their ability to live, to have sustenance and food. Deliberate policy of the United States government. So we have to remedy. There has to be association. There has to be a sharing of feeling on this. I don't know as a I came away from employment discrimination law feeling, and I think Beth has made some reference to this, feeling that the most important progress was being made where people in the facilities were saying to themselves, okay, we're going to make sure that whatever reforms are instituted are in fact instituted long after the lawyers and witnesses have gone away. We're the people who have to live with this. And I think that I first saw this in Seattle in the construction industry, and we tried to bring something like that into Detroit. I think this is where progress can be made, where there is a local self-help initiative in conjunction with whatever institutional reforms we seek to bring about.
Beth?
Yes, I do find most of the inspiration is at the local level, and just to root it into some of the indigenous movements, like Land Back, is also about like land stewardship. It's about a shared ethic, a shared set of practices that come from indigenous practices. And I think in our languages and in our practices, our ways of being, our ways of viewing the world and caring for the other beings in our world, the rivers and the waters of all kinds, that from indigenous, like I think indigenous-led movements that bring others into acts of restoration and care can be very successful, because they're coming out of these, these ancestral legacies, like these long-term experiences of being on this continent. I have a lot of faith in the overlap and in collaboration, being able to work toward justice for everyone.
Thank you. My last question, so if you care to ask this question, please go to the microphone. You've got a room full of partners here and collaborators. You've got a room full of scholars, many of whom work on precisely these issues and are expert at it. And then you have the multiplier effect with all of us and our students. What's your call for support and help and charge to a room full like this on these issues? What do you want them to know and do?
Thanks, Bill.
Well, of course, obviously, historians concerned with injustice are concerned with, it seems to me properly concerned with so many of the things that we've been speaking about these past few minutes, and I think so much research needs to be employed to shed more light on the circumstances of Black Americans in the 19th century. I think that I would like to see a group like this look at the idea of other ideas of reform and what can be done to address this. I would like them to take their research, as I'm sure they will, many steps further to examine the plight and circumstance of Black Americans in the 19th century. You know, I wanted to just read, if I could, quickly, this one passage from William B. Gould in his diary, when he says, "We will now begin by looking far into the past, beyond the Declaration of '76, to that memorable day when 11 Negro slaves landed at Jamestown, Virginia, and ask you, was it for any act of friendship that those benighted Africans were torn from their loved homes on the free plains of Africa's shores and transferred to the wilderness of America? Was it an act of friendship that those Dutch traders exposed those Negroes for sale? Was it an act of friendship that caused them to buy those misfortunate ones and make them the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, to clear their land, to build their cities, and to feed their mouths? And from the doings of that eventful day spring all the evils of slavery in this country. From that day's work spring the," and here the diary is incomplete, and I would like to see a group like this carry forward more explanation, more research on the kind of thing that William B. Gould articulated about the 19th century as a vehicle to address the society in 2023.
Thank you, Bill. Beth?
I think a lot of historians already do this, but bringing archival materials back to their home communities and back to their families. When you're talking about the Indigenous every day, I think about, going to the Idaho Historical Society and flipping through photographs of Nez Perce people, and there's my great-grandmother. I'm like, oh, I've never seen this picture. We don't have this picture. This, like a lot of our family albums are actually archives in state institutions. And so I think when you are coming across material that, you see family photos, you see some really fascinating document or some story, take it back, give copies to the tribe, let them know that they're there, because, they're out fighting the pipelines, don't have a lot of time to get into the archives, and you and your students do.
That's great. Please join me in thanking Beth and Bill for this evening. We'd be happy if we can get the house lights up. We'd love to have you ask your questions through the microphone so everyone can hear. But if you care to just stand up and ask it, I'll be happy to repeat it to the crowd so everyone can hear it. It's a little dark there. Anyone have there's a question. Jared.
Beth and Bill, thank you. It's one thing for scholars like all of us in the room and yourselves to stand up and talk about something you're studying, but when what you're studying has such personal resonance, it's an extra weight that you have to pick up and carry into this room, and I want to thank you both for being willing to do that and share with us tonight. My question is about historical trauma. I'm in the midst of teaching a course on trauma and how it's passed on generationally within communities. And I'm interested in the question of persistence, both the way that hurts and pains of the past persist in communities over time, and also the way in which those communities themselves persist and even flourish in the face of those past hurts. And my students and I have been asking questions about what are the historical mechanisms by which persistence happens. With trauma, we've talked about storytelling and memories that get passed down across generations. We've also talked about the reproduction of economic disadvantage over time, where economic disadvantage in one generation begets the same in the next generation, and so on and so forth. Next week, we'll be looking at epigenetics and talking about biological and genetic ways in which trauma persists. But I'm just wondering if I'd like to invite one or both of you to comment on, either through your own family's experiences or your study as scholars, on what do you think, what are the mechanisms by which painful pasts persist into the present, and how do communities persist in the face of those?
Thank you, Jared. Bill?
Of course, there are really two levels to this. I think one is the more well-known, chronicled, and that is the organizations, the Niagara movement, the emergence of the NAACP, the resort to litigation, the use of self-help, particularly as the 50s and the 60s unfolded. I think the willingness, and I count my own family as part of this, to have a unqualified patriotic view of this country. The words that were supposed to guide our conduct in this country, and yet to simultaneously call out the failure of the nation to adhere to those words. I think the other thing is my father used to talk often about so many of his friends. There were so many people who were so able and well-read, and whose aspirations were completely obliterated for a generation of people. You wonder, we talk about mental health, you wonder why it was that there was not more, a higher degree of insanity amongst the people who were victimized by this. And I think that there was such strength. And I think that the memory of this it was carried forth, I know in my case, through music, through songs, through the Battle Hymn of the Republic, through marching through Georgia, through the other songs that my father would sing to us in conjunction with talking about history. I think that those are some of the ways in which we can look to both institutions and individuals.
Beth?
I think that the spiritual life, again, ceremonies, I think that grief is one of the things that we're born into. One of the responsibilities that we have is to grieve those losses. And, my tribe every year will do a empty saddle ride out to Bear Paw, where the surrender speech happened. There are other kinds of ceremonies through the year, empty saddle ceremonies, remembering those who didn't survive. So I think that those regular ceremonial memories and the horses help us grieve too, like having horses, like the whole thing is part of an ongoingness, along with just our basic constitution, which is never give up. I mean, that's real. The other thing I want to say specifically about language and trauma, a lot of us are dealing with endangered languages. And so we know that like post-traumatic stress is the experience of either, you are in mortal danger or someone close to you is in mortal danger. And so one of the things that we have to overcome when we're bringing people back to the language is PTSD, because the language is something close to them that is in danger. And actually having traumatic responses to entering into the language is something that we have to deal with. So we have to find ways to calm the body, come into the language in a gentle way and heal the body. It's not just like going to school and learning the words, but there's a whole system of having to deal with the body because of trauma and the way that linguicide was carried out against our communities.
I think one of the things that is terribly important are symbols. The enormous amount of taxpayer money was spent creating all these Confederate statues. My wife and I, when we drove through Richmond, Virginia, we went through this avenue seeing all the Confederate statues, including the Secretary of Navy for the Confederacy that was trying to destroy the United States Navy. It's not simply a question of tearing things down as symbolic, as important as that is, but rather putting something in its place. A couple of years ago, some individuals who I had never met in Dedham, Massachusetts, where my great-grandfather lived after at the war's end, he became a leading citizen and built the Roman Catholic Church and founded the Episcopal Church in Dedham and became a leader of the Grand Army of the Republic, the veterans. These fellows read my book a couple of years ago. I'd never met them, and they dedicated a park to William B. Gould, and then they built a statue of William B. Gould, which was unveiled on Memorial Day of this year. And I think we have to have more of that, more of the symbol, more of the things that attract the attention of all of us. It's not enough to tear down. Again, we must repair. And I think this is not the whole story by any means, not the major part of the story, but an important part of the story.
Thank you both. Well, I think we've reached the conclusion of our plenary. I want to thank our guests very much. Thank you for coming. Warm thanks to our wonderful Los Angeles Public Library. Please go out and enjoy the rest of your evening in LA. It's a beautiful night. Thanks for being here.